The Office of Legislative Counsel of the Department of Justice argued in 1962 that this provision of funds for covert action, even though only known to a few members of Congress, constituted congressional ratification of the CIA's conduct of covert action. Congress has continued over the years since 1947 to appropriate funds for the conduct of such covert activities. We understand that the existence of such covert activities has been reported on a number of occasions to the leadership of both houses and to members of the subcommittees of the Armed Services and Appropriations Committees of both houses. It can be said that Congress as a whole knows that money is appropriated to the CIA and knows generally that a portion of it goes for clandestine activities, although knowledge of specific activities is restricted to the group specified above and occasional other members of Congress briefed for specific purposes. In effect, therefore, the CIA has for many years had general funds approval from the Congress to carry on covert Cold War activities, which the executive branch has the authority and responsibility to direct. It is well established that appropriations for administrative action, of which Congress has been informed, amount to a ratification of or acquiescence in such action. Brooks versus DeWar, 313 U.S. 354-361. Fleming versus Mohawk Co., 331 U.S. 111-116. See also Ivanhoe Irreg Distribution versus McCracken, 357 U.S. 275, 293 to 294. Power Reactor Co. versus Electricians, 367 U.S. 396, 409. Since the circumstances effectively prevent the Congress from making an express and detailed appropriation for the activities of the CIA, the general knowledge of the Congress and specific knowledge of responsible committee members outlined above are sufficient to render this principle applicable. In brackets, citations omitted. In brackets, footnote 93. Pausing the reading to read footnote 93. Memorandum RE, quote, constitutional and legal basis for so-called covert activities of the Central Intelligence Agency, end quote. Prepared by the Office of Legislative Counsel, Department of Justice, January 1762, pages 12 to 13. The Office of Legislative Counsel apparently placed considerable weight on the knowledge of the subcommittee members of the committees having jurisdiction over the CIA. Ibid, page 12 and 4. And implied, quote, close contact, end quote, between the CIA and it, quote, its committees, end quote. Ibid, page 13 and 5. For example, the memorandum cited a letter dated May 2nd, 1957, from Mr. Allen W. Dulles, Director, CIA, to Senator Hennings in Freedom of Information and Secrecy in Government. Hearing before the Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights of the Senate Committee of the Judiciary, 85th Congress, Second Session, pages 376-377. Quote, the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency appears regularly before established subcommittees of the Armed Services and Appropriations Committees of the Senate and of the House and makes available to these subcommittees complete information on agency activities personnel, and expenditures. No information has ever been denied to their subcommittees." End quote. Resuming the reading. And in December 1975, the House Select Committee on Intelligence was told by the CIA that given, quote, CIA reporting of its covert action programs to Congress and congressional appropriation of funds for such programs, end quote, the, quote, law is clear that under these circumstances, end of page 497, beginning page 498, Congress has effectively ratified the authority of the CIA to plan and conduct covert action under the direction of the President and National Security Council, end quote. Footnote 95. Pausing the reading to read footnote 95. Rogovin, HSIC, December 975, page 1736. Resuming the reading. In order to analyze the claim that congressional provision of funds to the CIA constitutes congressional ratification of the CIA's authority to conduct covert action, the general question of congressional ratification by appropriation must be examined. The general rule has been stated as follows, quote, ratification by appropriation is not favored and will not be accepted where prior knowledge of the specific disputed action cannot be demonstrated clearly, end quote. Footnote 96. Pausing the reading to read footnote 96. D.C. Federation of Civic Associations versus ARIS 391 F2D 478 482 D.C. Circ 1968. Resuming the reading. In the same opinion, the court noted that ratification by appropriation, no less than ratification by acquiescence, requires affirmative evidence that Congress actually knew of the administrative policy. Moreover, to constitute ratification, an appropriation must plainly show a purpose to bestow the precise authority which is claimed, end quote. In brackets, citations omitted, end brackets. Appropriations do not convey authority or ratify agency acts without proof that Congress knew what the agency was doing. For instance, in Green versus McElroy, 360 U.S. 474, the Supreme Court held that an appropriation to the Department of Defense for its security program did not constitute ratification of a procedure which denied the right of an individual to confront the witnesses against him. On the other hand, if appropriations are enacted after objections have been made to the appropriations committees that no legal authority exists to carry out a particular project, congressional acknowledgement or ratification of the authority to perform the specified act can be inferred. Footnote 97. In sum, general appropriations for an agency cannot be deemed to be ratified of a specific activity of that agency in the absence of congressional knowledge of the specific activity and congressional intent that the specific activity be funded from the general appropriation. Footnote 98. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 97. United States ex rel. Tennessee Valley Authority versus Two Tracts of Land 456 F2D 264 6th Circ 1972. Appropriations for the Vietnam War, in combination with other congressional actions, were held by most courts to constitute congressional authorization for the war. See e.g. Burke versus Laird, 317 F. Sup. 715, ed. NY, 1970. But see Mitchell versus Laird, 488 F. 2D, 611, D.C. Sir, 1973. Footnote 98. Thompson versus Clifford, 408 F. 2D, 154, D.C. Sir, 1968. Sutherland Statutory Construction, Sands Edition, 1974, Section 49.10. Resuming the reading. The argument that through the provision of funds to the CIA, Congress has effectively ratified the authority of the CIA to conduct covert action rests on the assumption that since the founding of the agency, Congress has known that CIA was engaged in covert action and has provided funds to the CIA with the knowledge and intent that some of the funds would be used for covert action. The CIA's conduct of covert action was not known by Congress as a whole during the early years of the CIA. In the interest of security, few members were informed about covert actions, a situation which, end of page 498, beginning page 499, continued until Congress mandated disclosure to 6 congressional committees of CIA activities not intended solely for intelligence gathering. Footnote 99. Pausing the reading to read footnote 99. 22 U.S.C. 2422. Resuming the reading. Even prior to this mandate, many members of Congress, not briefed on covert action by the executive branch, probably knew that the CIA had engaged in covert actions, such as the Bay of Pigs. This knowledge was not official, being based neither on declarations of official U.S. policy, nor on briefings of the Congress as a whole, but rather on information gained from other sources. Footnote 100. One of the reasons offered for the 1974 amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act was that it would ensure that Congress would have sufficient information about covert action to determine if such activities should continue. Footnote 101. It is difficult to fix a point in time in the past when it could be said with assurance that Congress as a whole, quote, clearly, end quote, had the knowledge of covert action required for congressional ratification. Footnote 102. Congress certainly has that knowledge today. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 100. Under the system of plausible denial, the U.S. government would not officially confirm that it engaged in covert action, and would seek to avoid acknowledging a U.S. government role in any particular covert action. Therefore, the knowledge imputed to members of Congress not officially briefed on the CIA's covert actions would have to be based on other sources. Footnote 101. Cong. Rec. S. 18065, Daily Edition, October 2nd, 74. Remarks of Senators Baker and Symington. Footnote 102. It might be argued that Congress chose to limit knowledge of covert action to selected members and that their knowledge combined with that congressional decision would be sufficient. J. Edwin Dietel, or Dietel, of the Office of General Counsel of the CIA, in a November 20, 1973 memorandum for the record, in fact wrote, quote, "We would also note that while the specific activities that the agency's appropriations are used for is limited to only a few members of Congress, the whole Congress chose to adopt that procedure for reviewing the agency's activities and appropriations." End quote. First, it must be noted that until Congress, quote, "knew," end quote, about covert action, Congress could not delegate to a small group of members the responsibility for overseeing it. When Congress reached that point of knowledge, and as noted, it is impossible to say when that was, it arguably could delegate, although there may be limits to that decision. Given the presumption against ratification by appropriation, the difficulty in fixing a time when Congress, quote, "knew," end quote, as well as the small number of knowledgeable members, and the question of whether Congress could delegate to these members the congressional knowledge required for ratification, it cannot be concluded that the knowledge of these few members met the test cited for ratification by appropriation. Resuming the reading. Congress certainly has that knowledge today. The first requirement, congressional knowledge of covert action by the CIA, is, at least now, met. In the future, appropriation to the CIA without any provision prohibiting the use of funds for covert action would ratify the CIA's authority. But did the provision of funds to the CIA in the past, or will the provision of funds in the future, under the present arrangements, constitute, quote, appropriations, end quote, which, quote, plainly show a purpose to bestow the precise authority which is claimed, end quote? The answer would be a clear yes if the funding had been or were to be by open appropriations to the CIA. The answer would be yes if Congress as a whole had voted the appropriations to the CIA in executive session. This has not been the case. The funds provided to the CIA are concealed in appropriations made to other agencies. They are then transferred to the CIA pursuant to the provisions of the CIA Act of 1949. Footnote 103. Pausing the reading to read footnote 103. 50 U.S.C. 403F. Resuming the reading. With the approval of, end of page 499, beginning page 500, the OMB and selected members of the Appropriations Committee, Congress as a whole never specifically votes on funds for the CIA. Congress as a whole does not know how much money the CIA will receive in a given year. Footnote 104. This secret funding undercuts the argument that the Congress has notified the CIA's conduct of covert action by by knowingly appropriating funds to be used for covert action. In fact, there is some doubt that the CIA is even, quote, appropriated, end quote, funds pursuant to the constitutional requirement. Footnote 105. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 104. For a fuller discussion of the funding of the CIA, see Chapter 16, page 367. Footnote 105. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 of the Constitution provides that, quote, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, end quote. Appropriations are, by definition, specific amounts of money set aside for designated purposes. In brackets, Geddes versus United States, 39 CT, claims 428, 444, 1903, year, in brackets. It is not required to particularize each item in order for an appropriation to be valid. In brackets, United States versus State Bridge Commission, 109 F sub 690 or 690, ED Mitch, 1953, in brackets. But the appropriation must be sufficiently identifiable to make clear the intent of Congress. Ibid. As Congress votes on appropriations for other agencies from which CIA funds are secretly transferred, rather than setting aside a specific sum of money for the CIA for a specific purpose, it can be argued that there is no constitutionally valid appropriation to the agency. If the public accounting required by Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 is a necessary condition for a constitutionally valid appropriation, it would be even harder to argue the validity of the present funding scheme, as the statement published pursuant to the constitutional requirements do not reflect receipts and expenditures of the CIA. The argument might be made that congressional establishment of the transfer provisions of the CIA Act of 1949 manifested a congressional purpose to authorize the CIA to conduct covert action. However, nothing in the debate supports this argument. Moreover, the transfer provision was equally applicable to any clandestine activity, including the clandestine collection of intelligence. Resuming the reading. Even if the provision of funds is constitutionally valid, in the absence of a vote by Congress on the funding, it can hardly be said to, quote, plainly, end quote, demonstrate a congressional intent to ratify the CIA's authority to conduct covert action. The CIA ignored the questionable nature of Congress's knowledge of covert action and the secret funding of the CIA in claiming that, quote, the law is clear that, under these circumstances, Congress has effectively ratified the authority of the CIA to plan and conduct covert action under the direction of the President and the National Security Council, end quote. Footnote 106. In support of its position, the Central Intelligence Agency cited what was described as, quote, the leading case on this point, end quote, Brooks versus DeWar, 313, U.S. 354, year 1941. According to the Central Intelligence Agency, quote, the Brooks case requires the conclusion that Congress has ratified the CIA's authority to plan and conduct covert action, end quote. Footnote 107. Brooks involved a challenge to a licensing scheme established by the Secretary of the Interior under a statute providing him with broad responsibility for the administration of livestock grazing districts. Although the act in question did not explicitly authorize him to require persons wishing to utilize the land to purchase licenses, the court found congressional ratification of his actions. The court, in upholding this Secretary's argument that Congress had ratified his action, wrote, quote, the information in the possession of Congress was plentiful and from various sources, end quote. Footnote 108. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 106. Rogovan HSIC hearings. December 975, page 36. Footnote 107. Ibid. Footnote 108. 313 U.S. at 360. Resuming the reading. The court cited annual reports of the end of page 500, beginning page 501. Secretary, testimony at Appropriation Committee hearings, and statements on the floor of Congress. The court found that the, quote, repeated appropriations of the fees thus covered and to be covered into the Treasury constitutes a ratification of the action, end quote. Footnote 109. Pausing the reading to read footnote 109. Ibid. Resuming the reading. Given the special treatment of the CIA, the relevance of Brooks seems questionable. Quote, plentiful, end quote, information is not available. No annual reports are issued by the Director of Central Intelligence. Until recently, there have been few open hearings or floor debates on the activities of the CIA. Congress as a whole has never voted on appropriations for the CIA, nor designated funds for covert action. Brooks and several other cases are also cited by a Justice Department memorandum written in 1962 and presented to the House Select Committee on Intelligence in 1975. The memorandum argues that, since the circumstances effectively prevent the Congress from making an express and detailed appropriation for the activities of the CIA, the general knowledge of the Congress and specific knowledge of responsible committee members are sufficient to render this principle, in brackets ratification, in brackets applicable. Footnote 110. Pausing the reading to read footnote 110. Rogovan, HSIC, December 9, 75, page 1736. Resuming the reading. Given the presumption against ratification by appropriation, the small number of knowledgeable members, the uncertainty as to whether congressional knowledge required for ratification could be imputed from the knowledge of these few members, and the question of whether a congressional appropriation can be imputed from the approval of secret transfers of funds to the CIA by subcommittees of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees, there is substantial doubt as to the validity of this position. As was previously noted, the actual state of congressional knowledge about covert action prior to the 1970s is unclear. Congress, however, now knows that the CIA conducts covert action. Congress also knows that the executive claims Congress has authorized the agency to do so. Footnote 111. Finally, Congress knows that the CIA receives its funds through secret transfers of funds appropriated to the Department of Defense. Footnote 112. And that some of the transferred funds are used to finance covert action. In the future, the failure by Congress to prohibit funds from being used for covert action by the CIA would clearly constitute congressional ratification of the CIA's authority, eliminating any ambiguity. Footnote 113. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 111. Congressional acquiescence with notice of long-standing executive policy creates a presumption in favor of that policy's validity. United States versus Midwest Oil Co. 236 U.S. 459, year 1915. See also Seaback versus Wilson and Co. 312 U.S. 1, year 1941. In brackets. Footnote 112. Congressional Records H9359-76, Daily Edition, October 1st, 75. Footnote 113. Congress clearly has the authority to attach conditions to the use of funds appropriated by it. In brackets, Ohio versus United States Civil Service Commission, 65 F. Sup. 776. SD Ohio, year 1946. Spalding versus Douglas Aircraft Co., 60 F. Sup. 985, 988, year 1945. AFF apostrophe D, 154 F 2D, 419. 9th Sir, year 1946, in brackets. End of page 501, beginning page 502. Such ratification, however, like ratification by acquiescence, footnote 114, would still be disfavored, footnote 115. As the Supreme Court has cautioned, quote, "It is at best treacherous to find in congressional silence alone that adopting of a controlling rule of law," end quote. Footnote 116. It would seem that important activities of the United States government deserve direct and specific authorization from Congress. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 114. The theory that congressional acquiescence constitutes ratification that can be easily stretched. J. Edwin D. Till, Assistant General Counsel of the agency, wrote a memorandum for the record dated May 7, 1974. In it, he described a question submitted by Senator Proxmire to Director Colby. During Colby's question, submitted by Senator Proxmire. Sorry about that. Submitted by Senator Proxmire to Director Colby during Mr. Colby's nomination hearing, which concerned the agency's secret financing of political parties. Mr. D. Till wrote that in a classified response, Mr. Colby stated that the CIA has, over the last 25 years of its existence, provided secret financial assistance to political parties in a number of foreign countries. Quote, "As there have been no reverberations from the statement, there is at least tacit approval for this type of activity," end quote. Footnote 115. Thomas versus Clifford, 408 F2D 134 166, D.C. Sir, year 1968. See also Norman Dorson testimony, House Select Intelligence Committee hearings, December 9, 75, page 1741. Resuming the reading. Section D. The Holtzman and Aburzek Amendment of 1974. In 1974, Congress directly addressed the issue of the Central Intelligence Agency's conduct of covert action. In September, the House of Representatives defeated an amendment which would have forbidden the Central Intelligence Agency to spend funds, quote, "for the purpose of undermining or destabilizing the government of any foreign country," end quote. In October, the Senate defeated an amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act of 1974, which would have forbidden any agency of the United States government to carry out, quote, any activity within any foreign country which violates or is intended to encourage the violation of the laws of the United States or of such countries, end quote, except for activities, quote, necessary, end quote, to the security of the United States and intended, quote, solely, end quote, to gather intelligence. While both amendments would have limited the ability of the Central Intelligence Agency to conduct covert action, the failure of Congress to adopt them does not clearly constitute congressional ratification of the CIA's authority to conduct covert action. Footnote 117. Neither dealt with covert action in general. Strong opposition to even their consideration prior to hearings and committee reports was voiced. The amendments, however, did signal an increasing congressional concern over covert action and marked the beginning of attempts by Congress as a whole to regulate and obtain information on covert action. In September 1974, Representative Holtzman proposed a joint resolution which would have amended the Supplemental Defense Appropriations Act as follows. After September 30, 1974, none of the funds appropriated under this joint resolution may be expanded by the Central Intelligence Agency for the purpose of undermining or destabilizing the government of any foreign country. End of page 502. Beginning page 503. Ms. Holtzman introduced the amendment in response to revelations about the efforts of the CIA to, quote, destabilize and undermine the government in Chile, end quote, and as a, quote, beginning, end quote, in, quote, restoring congressional prerogatives over the activities of the government of this country, end quote. Footnote 118. Ms. Holtzman stressed her opposition to such activities directed against foreign governments with whom the United States was not at war, quote, especially in an atmosphere of virtually complete secrecy without approval by the Congress or approval by the people of this country, end quote. Footnote 119. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 118. Congressional Records H9492-9493, Daily Edition, September 24, 74. Remarks of Rep. Holtzman. Footnote 119. Congressional Records H9492, Daily Edition. September 24, 74. Resuming the reading. The amendment was supported by Representative Giaimo. Sorry. Excuse me. Who noted, since we have been informed of the improper activities of the CIA in Chile, and perhaps in other countries, and we have certainly been informed of its wrongful activities in Chile, this is the first opportunity which we have had in Congress to voice either approval or disapproval of the actions of our government as they relate to the CIA. This is the first bill before us which presents us that opportunity. It is too late for us as a practical matter to do anything in the defense appropriation bill, but it is not too late now for us to approve this amendment and to show to the world that the U.S. Congress will not sanction these nefarious and covert activities of the CIA. that the people of the United States will not approve and ratify the improper and wrongful acts of the CIA in Chile. End quote. Footnote 120. Pausing the reading to read footnote 120. Ibid. P. H. 9493. Remarks of Representative Giaimo or Giaimo. My apologies for not knowing how to pronounce that name, excuse me. Resuming the reading. The amendment was opposed by Representative Mahon, who argued that the bill was, quote, irrelevant, end quote, because the defense appropriation bill would be signed into law within a few days. Footnote 121. And because the legislation contained no proposal to undermine or destabilize any government. Footnote 122. He described as, quote, indefensible, end quote, the presentation of the amendment as there had not been sufficient hearing by any of the committees of the House. Footnote 123. He was joined in his opposition by Representative Sederberg, a member of one of the CIA oversight subcommittees in the House, who indicated his belief that U.S. activities in Chile were taken, quote, in the best interest of the United States, end quote. Footnote 124. And by Representative Conlon, who argued that the amendment would lead to an identification of all our intelligence agents throughout the world and the destruction of the, quote, basic defenses, end quote, of the United States. A vote for the amendment, Representative Conlon cautioned, would, quote, cut off our covert intelligence operations, end quote, and, quote, would be a vote for national suicide, end quote. Footnote 125. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 121. Ibid. Remarks of Representative Mahon. Footnote 122. Ibid. Footnote 123. Ibid. Footnote 124. Ibid. P. H. 9494. Remarks of Mr. Sederberg. Never mind. Footnote 125. Ibid. Remarks of Representative Conlon. Resuming the reading. The proposal was defeated by the House of Representatives on September 30, 1974, by a vote of 291 to 108. Given this debate, the defeat of the amendment cannot be read as congressional ratification of the CIA's authority to conduct covert action. End of page 503, beginning page 504. The absence of hearings, the possible, quote, irrelevance, end quote, of the amendment noted by both supporters and opponents of the bill, and the fact that the amendment only dealt with activities, the purpose of which was the, quote, undermining or destabilizing the government of any foreign country, end quote, all undercut an expansive reading of Congress's failure to adopt it. On October 2nd, 1974, Senator Alborez introduced an amendment, number 1922, to the Foreign Assistance Act of 1974, which read as follows: illegal activities in foreign countries. A. No funds made available under this or any other law may be used by any agency of the United States government to carry out any activity within any foreign country which violates or is intended to encourage the violation of the laws of the United States or of such countries. B. The provision of this section should not be construed to prohibit the use of such funds to carry out any activity necessary to the security of the United States, which is intended solely to gather intelligence information. The amendment triggered a more extended floor debate than that generated by the Holtzman Amendment. Footnote 126. During the debate, Senator Aborez asserted that his amendment would, quote, abolish all clandestine or covert operations by the Central Intelligence Agency, end quote. Footnote 127. He argued that even the director of the CIA had indicated that the national security would not be endangered if covert action were abolished. Footnote 128. Some of the opponents of the amendment argued that the improved congressional oversight would be preferable to banning covert action. Senator Church noted that he could envision situations where threats to national security would require covert activities. Footnote 129. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 126. See Congressional Records S18051-2 18056, Daily Edition, October 2nd, 1974. Footnote 127. Ibid. P. 18051. Remarks of Senator Aborez. Footnote 128. Ibid. Footnote 129. Ibid. Remarks of Senator Church. Resuming the reading. The amendment failed of passage. It might be argued that this failure, like that of the Holtzman Amendment, constituted congressional ratification for the CIA's conduct of covert action. The logic of this is undercut by a number of factors. One is that the amendment was not directed to all covert action, although the comments of some of the members implied that it was. Footnote 130. It was directed to activity abroad, quote, which violates or is intended to encourage the violation of laws of the United States or of such country, end quote. Thus, if failure to pass the amendment is to be read as congressional ratification of the actions which the amendment sought to prohibit, the Congress would have ratified only those foreign activities by the CIA which are illegal or intended to encourage the violation of law. End of page 500. Now I'm going to read footnote 130. Senator Aborez stated that the amendment would, quote, abolish all clandestine or covert operations, end quote, while Senator Church argued that increased oversight would be better than a complete prohibition. On the other hand, Senator Hatfield opposed the amendment as it did not go far enough in merely prohibiting the use of funds to carry out illegal foreign covert action. He argued that the capacity for any covert action should be taken away from the CIA. Senator Metzenbaum argued for the amendment's passage precisely because it was aimed only at illegal activities abroad by the CIA. End of page 504, beginning page 505. Whether the amendment passed or failed, it left unchanged whatever authority, if any, the CIA then had to conduct covert actions abroad which were illegal, neither at home nor overseas. Finally, The question of whether the amendment's failure should be read as congressional ratification of the CIA's authority to conduct such activities as would have been banned must be viewed in the light of other and telling arguments raised by those to the amendment. Several senators, including Senators Humphrey, Stennis, and Goldwater, objected to the fact that the amendment had not had the benefit of analysis by the committees with proper jurisdiction. Without the benefit of consideration by the Armed Services Committee, the amendment would be, according to Senator Stennis, quote, a shot in the dark, end quote. Footnote 131. Pausing the reading to read footnote 131. See Congressional Record S18052, Daily Edition, October 2nd, 74. Remarks of Senator Stennis. Resuming the reading. Using a different argument in opposition, Senator Baker stated that there existed, quote, an insufficient state of information, end quote, by which to judge whether covert operations were or were not properly conducted. In place of the amendment, he suggested that a proposed Joint Committee on Intelligence Oversight be established. Congress could then be supplied with sufficient information on covert action to make a judgment as to whether it should be banned or controlled by some other device. Footnote 132. Pausing the reading to read footnote 132. Ibid. P. S18065. Remarks of Senator Baker. Resuming the reading. Given the fact that the amendment would prohibit only those foreign activities by the CIA which were illegal, the lack of explicit authorization for the CIA to conduct any covert action, the opposition of a substantial number of senators to the amendment's consideration before it was examined by the committee with appropriate jurisdiction, and the statements by certain senators that not enough was known about covert action to take position on its continuance. The amendment's failure can hardly be given much weight in determining whether Congress has ratified the CIA's authority to conduct covert action. Section E, the Hughes-Ryan Amendment. In 1974, Congress passed a significant amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act. The amendment provided that no funds might be expended by the CIA for operations not intended solely for obtaining necessary intelligence. In the absence of a presidential finding that the operation is important to the national security of the United States, and a timely report to the appropriate committees of the Congress. The amendment does not specifically authorize covert action by the CIA or unambiguously demonstrate congressional intent to provide such authorization. It does provide support for the position that Congress has authorized the CIA to conduct covert action, or, more specifically, activities that are not intended solely for intelligence gathering. The debates indicate, however, a desire on the part of some senators to withhold a decision on whether to authorize covert action until the reporting requirement provided Congress with more information. End of page 505, beginning page 506.